Recently, I heard that koalas, due to these bushfires, have become functionally extinct. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, or even whether they had the ability to assess that at the time with all the carnage that was going on. But what does it mean for a species to be functionally extinct? We'll talk about that after the intro. So, let's say that the koalas are functionally extinct. What does that mean? What it means is that we actually have koalas that we could go and see in the wild or in the zoo or whatever, but they'll be gone in a few generations, and they'll be gone because their population has got so small that they don't have the genetic diversity to continue. This has been seen with many species, and a classic one is the American buffalo, or it's really a bison, but they call it the buffalo. They were hunted to such an extent that their population is very, very small. Now, there's been breeding programs and scientists have been working, but it's still very difficult to maintain that population because they were shrunk to such an extent that they didn't have the genetic diversity to continue. Now, what does this tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is that there could never have been just two human beings. They wouldn't have had the genetic diversity. Now, I've seen apologists trying to come up with all sorts of things, post hoc rationalizations trying to make the Bible still true. But we know a lot about human evolution. We know evolution maps and so on, and we knew a lot of that stuff just from archaeology before we had genetics. And now the fact that we know there were never just two people is literally written in our genetic code. So this calls into question not only the story of Adam and Eve, but also Noah's flood. I mean, after the flood, there would have been 8 human beings. Now that's not a genetically viable population. If you look up minimum viable population, you'll see for humans it's way more than 8, even at the lowest estimates. And there would have only been 2 of every other animal. So they'd have all been functionally extinct as well. And this is what science actually tells us. And it's in conflict with what's written in this old book. I can tell you that I have personally sat in an assembly at a religious school and had a religious leader stand up in front of the assembled school and tell them the Adam and Eve story like it's literally true. Not a "this is what I believe," a disclaimer, science doesn't agree with me, but literally tell them it like it's a fact. And the simple fact is that the facts actually go against what he said. Now, maybe it's just me, but I think that in schools we should be teaching kids things that we know to be true, or at least are our best estimates of what's true at the moment. And this applies in every class, not just science. As I said in the previous part of this video, I did not mind that Mr. McLeroy wanted to get some things into the curriculum where the students discuss things that science does not yet know. It just seemed to me that he wanted to put all of those things in there and it became a real focus. We know that science doesn't know everything. And it's fine for students to know about the things it doesn't know. But in all subjects, students should be told either the facts or the best thinking we have at the moment. It should be made clear which is which. I mean, in English class, we tell them that sentences should end with a full stop and start with a capital letter, and where to put commas and semicolons and things. These are factual things. So why is it okay to then tell children things as facts, which are just your beliefs, and which actually often contradict known facts? Now, Mr. McLeroy was trying to get this stuff into the curriculum at government schools. But what about private schools? If you look at private schools or independent schools, most of them have some sort of religious bent. For example, here in Western Australia we have Anglican schools, Lutheran schools, Baptist schools. I think there's a couple of Islamic schools. There's at least one Jewish school, there's an Adventist school, and so on. I've just reeled off a few. I'm sure there's many, many more. Well, all of these people, even the different Christian denominations, or there's some called just Christian schools, even the Christian denominations, they believe slightly different things to each other. So children that go to those different schools are being told different theology and often being told it as if it's a fact. This should not happen. If these things cannot be demonstrated to be true, they should not be being taught to children as if they're true. They should be being taught in the context of a faith-based belief. And it should be made very clear exactly what that means. And I wonder how Mr. McLeroy would feel about that. I wonder how he would feel if we were told, okay, in religious class, we need to teach comparative religion and we need to teach them all of the shakiness of the foundations of your religion. For example, that the Gospels were written by anonymous authors. In Greek, these people could not possibly have been the followers of Jesus, if he even existed, because we don't have huge amounts of evidence that the Jesus character is even based on a real person or a composite of real persons. They need to be told about the stuff I said before, about how genetics and archaeology, how they conflict with the Adam and Eve story, how they conflict with the Noah's flood story, how the Exodus never happened, and all of the evidence against these things. They need to be taught the religion in the context that it goes against many of the facts. How about telling them about how the Bible was put together? So, Mr. McLeroy, do you think that's fair? If you want to go into science class and say, these are the things that aren't known, and I think that's perfectly okay. I think students should know what's known and what's not known, and what could falsify the things that we think we know. Then we go into religion class, and we have to tell them how their myth was put together. Now, in many parts of the world, independent schools are truly independent from the government. They raise all of their own fees and so on, and their money from investments and donations from former students and all this sort of stuff. Here in Australia, the independent schools are actually partially funded by the government. I'm not absolutely sure of this figure, but I believe that independent schools get something like $7,000 a year for each student that they have. And then those students often pay fees on top of that to go to those schools. So when we get things like stories that came out last year of a teacher at a Baptist school being sacked because he was gay, when the government turns around and says, well, they're an independent school, we don't have any power to do anything. Yes, you do. You could pull that $7,000 of student funding. What they did was against the law of the land. They discriminated against a person because of their religious beliefs. And that should never be allowed. They need to demonstrate the truth of their religious beliefs before they can do that, if you ask me. Can any of them demonstrate the truth? Now, I said about all of the different types of school that I just reeled off a few, I'm sure there's others. These schools all believe different things. So at best, one of them can be teaching the truth, and probably none of them are. Now, in your case, Mr. McLeroy, you're a young earth creationist, like Ken Ham, and they put out all these educational materials based on young earth creationism. Now, where did the whole idea of the earth only being 6,000 years, or the universe, because the earth basically is the universe as far as they're concerned, only being 6,000 years old? Well, that calculation was done by somebody called Bishop Ussher, and it was based on the begats in the Bible. Now, really, is that more reliable than radiometric dating? Every time I see somebody trying to poke holes in radiometric dating, it's things that scientists have pointed out already. Things like the reservoir effect, which is well known. And you can look that up. The reservoir effect is something that has an effect on carbon dating and is why certain animals date as being really old, even though we know they're still alive. You see, there's many times where your religion comes in conflict with science and you just deny the science in some way, try to poke holes, often where those holes don't exist. It's all about misinformation. And really, should misinformation be something that's going out to children in schools? Well, maybe it should, but it shouldn't be being told as if it's fact. It should be put out as misinformation and being labelled as such. This is the type of misinformation you'll come across because we should be teaching children how to think and how to be sceptical. So, in summary, Mr. McLeroy and others like you, you came into that conversation with Ra being very proud about the fact that you just come from teaching fourth graders about your religious nonsense. Maybe in those classes too, you should be forced to talk about Adam and Eve and then talk about all the evidence that goes against the fact that there was only ever two people. How would you feel about that? Now, as often happens when I finish recording and the video is processing, I think of some other things that I perhaps should have said, and I think this is going to lead on to a third part. So this page here is a website for the Lake Joondalup Baptist College, a school that I pass quite often when I'm driving. Now, this is their employment opportunities page, as I said, and they have things that most schools have on, staff code of conduct and so on. But notice just here, they have a statement of faith. And now I'm not going to go all the way through this statement of faith at this juncture, but I might do that as a third part to the video. But let's just have a brief look at it. So here we go. Here's their statement of faith. And let's just drag it in view a bit better. So you have to make a statement of faith about God, about Jesus, about the Holy Spirit, about the Bible, about the fact that you believe that there could be a distinct Satan. Satan could actually be real. You have to say all these things in order to work there. Even if you're teaching biology or history or English, you have to believe these things. Now, as I say, I think I'll do a third part to the video where I go into this in detail. But at the very least, that's a discriminatory hiring practice. It's a discriminatory hiring practice in that you're making sure that people believe stuff which goes against the best scholarship we have. Most biblical scholars do not think these things are correct, let alone science graduates. Now, as I've mentioned a few times in other videos, in 2017 in Australia, we had a plebiscite on marriage equality. So everybody got to vote on whether people should have equal rights to marriage. Now, I just did a Google search here, and you just scroll down here, do the same search yourself, and you'll find that there were a number of schools, as well as religious institutions, who wrote out to parents urging them to vote no because it was going to destroy the fabric of society. Now, in the case of schools in Australia, these are independent schools who still receive funding from the government, and yet they're directly trying to meddle in politics by doing what they're doing, by writing out to parents and urging them to vote no. Now, this all comes down to the privilege that religion seems to have in society. They all have beliefs that they cannot demonstrate to be true. Their beliefs cannot be demonstrated to be true. Think about that. And yet, on the basis of those beliefs, they're trying to meddle in politics while still receiving government funding. Should they be allowed to do that in a secular society? And just think for a second whether a private company had done that. If, say, Coles or Woolworths had written out to their customers and said to them that they should vote no to marriage equality, how would that have gone down? Religion seems to have a privilege in our society where these groups of people who cannot demonstrate the veracity of their beliefs still get to have a huge say in what goes on. Now, should that be happening? And really, with all the tax exemptions they get, as well as the schools getting this government funding, should they be able to do that on you and my taxes? Now, I apologise if this final note hasn't been as eloquent as I would like to be, but I feel really strongly about this and I tend to get a bit ranty. And I apologise for that, but rant seems to be the tone of many of my videos. And I do feel really strongly about this. There's no way that these people should be having a say in our society unless they can demonstrate the truth of what they claim.